get around, I get around, yeah, get around, round, round, I get around, I get around.
I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Look, there are musicians who make important music, and then there are musicians who change the way we listen to music. Brian Wilson was one of those. He was a force behind the Beach Boys. He was a force that changed all of pop music. He died yesterday at 82. Today, what Brian Wilson gave us. Jay Ferguson is here. He's a member of the Canadian band Sloan, and he's a huge fan of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. Jay, welcome to the show.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Yes, of course, man. Let's just start talking about how important was Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys? How important were they to you?
I mean, I was a big music fan growing up as a kid. I grew up in the 1970s. So the first real wave of Beach Boys music wasn't my music, but I remember there was I had a lot of cousins who were older than me, and they really liked the Beach Boys a lot. There was a record that came out in the 1970s called Endless Summer, which was like a collection of their 60s hits. Yeah. And I remember hearing that all the time. And so just as a kid, they were, their music and their hits were kind of ingrained in me. And they ended up being the very first concert that I went to see, which was in 1982 at the Metro Center in Halifax, where I grew up. And, at that point, I didn't know the deep catalog. I would have just known the hits, and I was very excited to go, and I loved it. And I had the good fortune, in hindsight, that Brian Wilson was in the, he had sort of been in the Beach Boys and then left the touring band and then came back. And so he was kind of drifting in and out, but he was there that night in Halifax, along with his brothers, Dennis and Carl, who also eventually passed away. So, I feel very fortunate that I got to see all of the Beach Boys play a show, and it was very exciting to me at the time. And it wasn't for, a couple of years after that, maybe in my mid-teens, where I would have discovered the later records like Pet Sounds and the Smile bootlegs that were around, and the later 60s records that were maybe not as heralded, but were equally rich musically. So they've always kind of been there in my life and influenced me musically a little bit later on, for sure.
Yeah, I think there's something that happens when you sort of interact with the Beach Boys and their music. Actually, a minute ago we were playing "I Get Around." Can we just bring that up one more time, actually? Just for
we always take my car, cause it's never been beat.
Come on.
We've never missed yet with the girls we meet.
It's just such a full-bodied sound. Like, there's just so much happening in the music, and it's just so rich and textured. When you think about this song, came out in 1964, what stands out for you as you listen to it?
I think what stands out is how much, Brian was able to, how many events he was able to pack into a 2-minute and 12-second song. You know what I mean? There's
events is a good word for it. Yeah,
it's true. It's like it starts right away. There's the overlapping vocals. There's the drop in the beat in the first verse, and then that little guitar riff that comes out of nowhere, and then you're into a chorus, and then the same thing happens again. Then there's a guitar solo and a key change, and a descending vocal that happens once and appears later but differently. There's so many ideas that are going on in a song, and I think it's an exercise in creative record making, and it must have sounded incredibly exciting in 1964, which would have been the height of Beatlemania, and for a song by another band to reach number one, I think really says something about a song. It might sound a bit old-fashioned today, but I think you could really take it apart. And it's a really great, like I said, exercise in songwriting, for sure.
I can't remember what song it was, but there was this prank that this Australian radio station played where they played a Beach Boys song and they said, hey, this is the brand new Tame Impala song. I mean, there's something about the music that is like, yes, it sounds like it's of that time, but also there's something about it that sounds timeless. And I think all the time about the thing that Bob Dylan said about Brian Wilson, which he said, that Brian Wilson is someone who can take a 4-track and make it sound like no one else can. If you had 100 tracks, you couldn't recreate the thing that he does with just 4. When you think about the Beach Boys and their sound, because it was just this very specific, unmistakable sound that even if you weren't raised on their music, even if you didn't grow up with it, you would still go, oh, I know what that is. That's the Beach Boys. How would you describe Brian Wilson and his influence on pop music?
I think what he did musically was so original, and I think the most interesting, I think, harbinger of his influence was how much his music and the Beach Boys' music affected the Beatles in that era in the 1960s. It sort of started out, Brian Wilson was obviously a Beatles fan, but he heard the Beatles album Rubber Soul. The story goes he heard it and he was like, "How? Wow, they made an album where there's no covers, there's no filler. It's this incredible standalone statement." And that sort of, almost inspired him to make Pet Sounds, a complete statement of a record. And then Paul McCartney, of course, hears Pet Sounds, and he goes, "Wow, look what look, the Beach Boys have done this. I'm gonna top them." And he goes and writes Penny Lane and those songs on Sergeant Pepper.
Yeah.
And then the story goes that Paul McCartney comes back to Brian and plays him A Day in the Life, from Sergeant Pepper.
Yeah.
And he tells him, Brian, you better catch up. Look where we're going, kind of thing. Which I think probably, set Brian's brain back a little bit. But, I mean, you can hear it in the Beatles, but if you go into the 70s, you can hear it in the Eagles, Fleetwood Mac, ABBA, and the Bee Gees, most definitely. And on into the 80s, you can hear it in XTC and Elvis Costello, and up to more modern times of like the Avalanches from Australia. You can hear it in their kind of sound collage recordings, and you can hear it in Tame Impala, as you mentioned, and even like Daft Punk name check Brian Wilson on Homework, their first album. So I think his influence has this long, trail, which can be felt to this day.
Yeah, like I think like a tale that is like certainly like very current, like it's still ongoing as we speak.
Yeah.
You mentioned sort of like the back and forth between the Beatles and the Beach Boys. Paul McCartney said that this was the best song ever made.
God only knows what I'd be without. God only knows what I'd be without. And God only knows what I'd be without. God only knows.
From 1966, God Only Knows. That's the track. That's a version of you're just listening to just the vocal layerings of the song, and even that is its own little symphony. What do you think was Brian Wilson's genius when you think about God Only Knows?
I think about that song and other songs. It was almost his ability and his gift to be able to synthesize so many things that he probably, I'm hypothesizing here, but, synthesizing so many things that he loved musically growing up, whether it was, Four Freshmen style barbershop harmonies and 50s rock and roll, like, Everly Brothers and Chuck Berry, but also classical music and Gershwin, and sort of, putting all of these things together, like I said, with his own songwriting gift and creating something brand new that was not only, musically progressive, but also had the ability to appeal to millions of people at the same time. So I think I think that doesn't always happen in popular music. Someone who's creating something that sounds new and unique, and where did this come from? But also at the same time appeals to so many people. You can hear it in the Beatles, and maybe like peak Joni Mitchell around the time of Court and Spark, and definitely like Prince in the 1980s, I think. So I think it's to me that's a unique happening, and I think it makes sense that Brian Wilson would qualify for that, I think.
I think there's something that we take for granted about some of the things that Brian Wilson did and the Beach Boys did. The idea that God Only Knows, just in the middle of the song, says like, this is the place that deserves a classical break. Just a giant pop song. How about a classical music break right in the middle of it? The idea that that's a new step, a thing that you can do, things that you hear and go like, I didn't even know you could even do that. And then there's also, this on the other hand, I think of the struggles that he had. Jay, I think of some of the struggles that he went through. I want you to hear this clip. It's from an interview that he did with Mike Douglas in 1976.
I say that drugs are not needed by a person of talent, that God blessed me with some talent. I never have utilized grass or any drugs or cocaine to actually, for a stepping stone to write or create music or create even a thought. I have been taught the difference by my psychiatrist, thank God, of a natural high and a drug high.
Are you off now of drugs?
Oh, I'm off cocaine, thank God. I mean, I did my dose of LSD. It shattered my mind, and I, came back, thank God, in I don't know how many pieces.
He went through a lot of mental health struggles throughout the years, and I think like there's something about a mind that creates some of the most beautiful music we've ever heard, but also a mind that has struggled a lot over the years. When you think about those two realities living in the same person, does that feel like a contradiction to you at all?
The contradiction of, you mean the mental struggle, but then creating the beautiful music? Is that? Yeah, it makes me wonder a little bit, or again, hypothesize. I wonder what his music would have sounded like without his mental struggles.
Hmm.
Like, how does that unfortunate thing that he had within him, how much did that inform his great artwork? And definitely, like Brian Wilson, a lot of people think of the peppy sort of surf and car songs and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
even during that era, there was an his music always had very much of a melancholy bent, and I wonder if
Yes.
that would have affected that. And I think that those some of those melancholy songs are some of his most beloved songs, like even God Only Knows, which
Hmm.
has a positive message, but it's not a cheerleader song. You know what I
No.
mean? It's definitely a melancholy thing. So I think, yeah, it's a good question to ask, and I would be curious. I wonder what his art would have sounded like
Hmm.
without those mental struggles, for sure.
Jay, got about 30 seconds left here. How do you think Brian Wilson is going to live on in your approach to music?
Uh, I don't know. I guess I've listened to it my whole life, and I
Yeah.
think I'll continue to listen to it. And I listen to Beach Boys for pleasure, but I play in a band, and we always are looking to write songs. And I think it's a rich, whatever, it sounds corny to say, rich tapestry, but it's a rich
Mhm.
catalog of music to pull inspiration from. So I think that's always going to continue for me, for sure.
Well, Jay, I appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Great, thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. Jay Ferguson is a member of the band Sloan and a massive fan of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. Brian Wilson died yesterday. He was 82. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Look, I first started hearing about Endless Cookie when it premiered at Sundance earlier this year. It's this Canadian animated documentary and has been charming audiences all over North America since then. It won the Audience Award here in Toronto at Hot Docs. Seth and Peter Scriver created Endless Cookie together. They're two half-brothers, one Indigenous, the other one white. And the documentary is about their relationship and so much more. Endless Cookie is finally coming to theaters. To talk about it, Sonya Ballantyne is here. Dave A. Robertson is here. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
What a nice time. I'm so delighted that you're here. Dave, first of all, welcome to the show for the first time. Nice to have you here. Second of all, let's get into Endless Cookie. This is an animated documentary. It does not have a linear narrative whatsoever. Can you just tell me a little bit about how it tells the story?
What's interesting, I know that Seth is white, Pete is Cree. I think Seth looks up to Pete quite a bit. And then there's definitely a lot of Indigenous elements to the storytelling here in this documentary. It's definitely like an absurdist film. The experience of the characters, you see them in this kind of non sequitur way in various situations. But when you look at like the heart of Indigenous storytelling, what I've seen, especially with like elders and knowledge keepers telling stories, is that it engages, first of all, like multiple senses and emotions. You come in and out of main points and themes. You kind of leave something, go off on a tangent, but you always kind of come back to it. You always return to it to make this really profound point. And that's what this documentary does over and over again. It has these moments that you kind of leave. Maybe you're interrupted by somebody flushing a toilet in like in the house somewhere,
Yeah.
and then you kind of come back midway through, and you're still like you're back on this guy getting his hand stuck in a trap, and then you leave again, and then and it all leads into this really profound final point this documentary makes about storytelling, about knowledge keepers, and about the relationship between the past and the present. So it is absurdist, it is nonlinear, but it also is, I think, really a great example of the beauty of Indigenous storytelling.
Yeah, the amount of interruptions in the documentary at first, you're like, am I watching the right thing? Is that supposed to be the next thing that follows in the story? And then before you know it, we eventually kind of like loop back to that element, and then it kind of continues further on. Sonia, I want to play that clip that Dave is talking about, because this is a movie that sort of immerses you in Pete's life, especially specifically in his home in Shamattawa First Nation in northern Manitoba. So let's hear that clip. Here's a clip of Peter telling Seth a story about setting up a trap.
And I set it up pretty good, I thought, if so an animal wouldn't be able to drag it away. And then I saw the bait fell off. So I thought, okay, I'll just stick the bait back on. And was just holding on to the top part of the trap when I went to stick
a
the
sec.
bait on.
Oh, sorry to stop you, but there's a toilet flush in the middle of the story.
Pete is completely like, yeah, that's fine. That's the thing that's gonna happen as I'm trying to tell the story. Sonya, what do you think about this documentary? Like, we have these moments of real life interruptions, right? We have the toilet flushing when and then you get to see a very serious sort of documentarian trying to be like, I was trying to record this, and then this toilet flush. The children are kind of like all over the place. The dogs are barking. It's present all throughout. What did you think when you saw all of this going on as we were trying to tell the story?
I really related to it personally, just because I grew up on a res. It reminded me a lot of living in my grandmother's house, because the walls of a res house are super thin, so you can always hear everything. Like, your dad wakes you up like snoring every day. It was just fun to see those little elements that were included. Like, people are still living in this house while all of this documenting is going on, and I just love that it shows a little bit of like the way Indigenous communities live generationally, and I just love that this it continues in the film too, by showing Cookie's animation and the kids' drawings and stuff like that. And I just love the little element of all the writing on the walls, because that was the way my childhood bedroom door had writing all over it too, from like the ages of 0 to like when I finally moved out. And it was just adorable to see that little slice of life of what it is like to live on a res. And yeah, it was just so beautiful to me.
So you mentioned Cookie. Cookie is the name of Pete's daughter, and the slice of life is like the perfect way to sort of describe what this documentary is that it's a slice of life in all that life has to offer. And Dave, when you watch this documentary, I think like in my head, I'm like, a documentary has to do with like making the background a bit pristine in order for a talking head to sit down and be like, here's the story I have to tell. And what this documentary does is say, we are not doing that. I think like there's a moment but early on in the documentary where you see a train kind of roll by that introduces you to all the characters, and you think, okay, these are 4 people. I can get used to this. And then eventually we get to 20, and then all the pets are in. And there is kind of a willingness to say, everyone is here, all the interruptions are here. Did that approach work for you, Dave?
Absolutely. First of all, I think that like hearing all of these different interruptions, it's funny how at first he's like, we all stop it. And then he's just like, you know what? This is part of it. This is who we are.
Yeah.
And I love that. One of the things I try to do, I actually do quite a bit of writing workshops. And one of the things I tell young writers is that you have to, more than anything, draw the reader into the world. You have to make the reader engaged. You have to make them connect. And that is through relatability and authenticity. And this documentary, I think, has that in spades. As much as it is this kind of psychedelic collage of different things, it also it gives you life. At its purest form. And that realism, it draws the viewer in this really connective way. And it not only connects to the characters, but through that connects to the story and this real humanity that we all share. Reconciliation, I think, is this whole thing of like us connecting with each other and over our shared humanity. And that's what this documentary has over everything else. It has humanity. And I think that is something that's so beautiful about this story.
Just on the comment that you said about how you do some writing workshops, it's a little bit like Martin Scorsese saying I direct some films. I mean, you wrote 4 books this year. I cannot even keep track of the number of writing things that you do. So I just wanted to just kind of draw out that particular comment that you made there. Sonya, one thing we haven't talked about yet is how funny this documentary is. It is so incredibly funny. Tell me about the way that humor operates in this documentary.
Oh, it's just a fun way. I really, one of my favorite parts of this movie is when the whole movie, they're rebuilding a teepee in the backyard. And there's a part where Seth is taking a picture inside of it while they're building it. And Pete's daughter, Simone, says, could you please not take a picture inside of the sacred teepee space? And he's like, oh, he's apologizing and saying sorry. And then she cuts him off. She's like, I'm just joking. Like, I'm just messing with you. But yeah, it's always good to ask. And I love those, like, those little bits of humor are just so adorable to me, because like the kids are messing with their uncle. Like, they're complaining sometimes about how long it's taking for them to record. And it's just so cute to have like that little bit of life. Because like I make documentaries as well. And like, like it's so different from how you would make a documentary, but it just is so much what it is like to grow up in a res, and it's just so funny to me and adorable.
And also, I will say, like, this is also a documentary that doesn't shy away from hard things to talk about, right? So it sort of references Pete talks about his daughter who died by suicide. There are frequent references to residential schools. What did you think of the way that the documentary sort of wove those stories into the movie, Sonya?
Well, I always like to think about how race, like, not, I'm probably talking just because I'm hungry right now, but I love to look at the Indigenous experiences as a pizza,
Okay.
and racism is like the pepperoni on that pizza. It's not the full experience of being Indigenous, but it's a large part of it. And I really love that, like, the way they presented, like, especially Pete's daughter's suicide. It's not so, despite the content, it's not presented in a sad way, just because they're honoring her by remembering her, saying that she's riding her motorbike in heaven and stuff like that. And it was just so touching for me to see, because like, yeah, like in any other culture, suicide is talked about with such darkness and reverence, but here it's like they just bring it up momentarily by saying, oh yeah, this was Jess, this thing I made for Jess when she took her life. And I was like, what? Like, I just remember how that hit you, and then you see this beautiful little animation piece they make to honor her, and I'm like, oh, that was just so beautiful to see. And I love the way they still talk about her like she's still around.
She was completely woven into the rest of the film, right? Like you see her in the introduction in terms of like one of the many characters who are in this movie. Dave, one thing we haven't talked about also is the animation style of this documentary, because it's not a straightforward animation. It's quite absurdist. There are limbs coming out of places you wouldn't expect. It's sort of a great time. Do you want to describe the way that this movie's animated?
Yeah, there's a lot of things in here that were reminiscent of, for me, of cartoons that I've watched, whether it is like, Family Guy, and it's kind of like, it also has these kind of like really weird sidebar scenes, but means less than in this film. SpongeBob comes to mind for me too, and there's actually probably more than any other one. And there's also a scene where this like guy's climbing up these chicken nets or whatever onto the top of a truck, and it reminded me a lot of a character you see in a YouTube series called "Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared," which is a really amazing series of really disturbing films. But there's like, in all of that, there's this subversiveness that I think, that helps like defy the expectations that the animations might set. It makes people feel a little uneasy, even through the humor and all this like life happening through it. And it makes the effectiveness of these really serious kind of moments in it, I think, really hit home. Whether it mentions briefly like residential schools. The disruptions of the RCMP officers into lives is hilarious, but also very, very real. Whether it's a suicide crisis. In Shamattawa, for example, it had a state of emergency in suicide for youth in 2021 into 2023 and 4, I believe. And so overrepresentation in incarcerations, racism in the court system. So it deals with all of this stuff, but it does it in this really bright, engaging, incredibly like nuanced, but like also absurdist, a cartoon style.
It's certainly there are scenes where you can't look away because you're like, I'm trying to figure out exactly what I'm looking at here. Sonya, I got about a minute left. This is a movie that won a film festival favorite. It's been a film festival favorite, won some audience awards. Why do you think audiences have connected to Endless Cookie?
Just because it's such a heartfelt story about like what the Indigenous experience and how what makes us human beings. I just love how it seamlessly weaves Indigenous storytelling with like this surreal art style. And I'm just like, I remember being so hesitant to watch the movie just because I was so turned off by the animation style. Like I was saying before we got on air, like I demand beauty in my content. But like and I remember I had my father-in-law was repeatedly trying to get me to watch it, and I'm like, I don't know if I want to watch it. But I was so glad when I was finally able to see it and just feel this connection. Like I've never been, despite the animation, I've never felt as seen in something as I felt in this one. And it just shows so much of like my childhood and my background that I was like, I really hope everybody gets to see this, because it captures something of the heart of being Indigenous. And I hope like a lot of people see it, or more people see it now that it's in theaters.
Well, I think that's a lovely place to leave it. I appreciate both of your time. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Buddy. Yes, of course. Sonya Ballantyne is a Swampy Cree filmmaker. David A. Robertson is an author. They were both in Winnipeg. Endless Cookies in theaters across the country starting tomorrow. My name is Elamin. This is Commotion. See you tomorrow.